learners, and welcome back to this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. As promised at the end of the previous lecture, we will transition today directly from a discussion of the popular periodical press in the Victorian era to studying a novel and its author, both of which were direct beneficiaries as well as, in some ways, direct victims of that popular periodical press in the Victorian era. The novel is The Picture of Dorian Gray, and the author is Oscar Wilde. And it is fitting, given the context in which the novel was written, to begin our study of the novel by situating the text in the print context of its time. The Picture of Dorian Gray was first published in July 1890 in a periodical which is the highly popular American monthly Lippincott's Monthly Magazine. This was published from the city of Philadelphia in the state of Pennsylvania. The editor of this magazine was J.M. Stoddart. This was a time when the periodical press was booming across Anglophone reading publics. North American readers were also very eagerly subscribing to and reading popular periodicals. Lippincott's was one such American periodical, and they were trying to increase their subscribers. They were trying to get an edge on their rivals such as Harper's and other popular American magazines. In a bid to increase subscribers, Stoddart and Lippincott reached out to new and newer kinds of writers. And in this case, Stoddart reached out to young, upcoming English writers. The reason for doing this is because the editors thought that the magazine's readers would be less familiar with these English writers. And this was true. Before this, Lippincott's tended to publish mostly American writers, and the kind of writing they published was of a very sensational and racy kind. So to add something different, to offer something new to their subscribers, Stoddart reached out to some young and upcoming English writers. Further, this seemed like a good gamble from the perspective of the editor, because these upcoming English writers would be willing and eager to submit their work to Lippincott's, an American magazine which promised thousands of new American readers, and publication in Lippincott's would be beneficial to these English writers who could boost their literary careers this way. So these were the reasons, and Stoddart reached out to 3 English writers, each of whom promised to submit a novelette. Stoddart for what we would today call a novella, that is a short novel. 3 English writers promised to submit a novelette each to Lippincott's in the late 1880s. This is when Stoddart made a trip to London to recruit these 3 English writers. The first of these was Arthur Conan Doyle, whose The Sign of 4 was published in Lippincott's magazine in February 1890. Subsequently, Oscar Wilde published The Picture of Dorian Gray in July 1890. And finally, Rudyard Kipling, the 3rd English writer thus recruited, published The Light That Failed in the January 1891 issue of Lippincott's Monthly Magazine. Now, to understand a little bit of Oscar Wilde and where Oscar Wilde was at this time, it's important to know that Stoddart's offer was welcomed by Oscar Wilde because this was a time when Wilde's career had not exactly taken off. He had had a mediocre, though promising start, but at this time was not very successful. He had published some poems, these were not very well received, and had since begun to make his career as a public speaker, enjoying some popularity with lectures on aesthetics, and among these most popular were his lectures on interior decoration. This was also the topic of most of his lectures in the 10-month tour of North America, which he undertook in 1882. Subsequently, he began to make his career as a journalist and wrote a lot of reviews and essays in newspapers such as the Pall Mall Gazette, and subsequently took up editorship in 1887 of the feminist periodical Woman's World. His literary career, one can say, really began at just the time when Stoddart's offer came. His publication, The Happy Prince and Other Tales, which was expanded from the fairy tales he told his sons, was published to good reviews, and he had a couple of successful years following this publication. The Decay of Lying was a very powerful essay that Wilde published in the prestigious journal 19th Century, and this was followed by the novella The Portrait of Mr. W.H., which is based on the love triangle which is hinted at but not described in Shakespeare's sonnets. This was published in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine in the year 1899. So this is where Oscar Wilde was at the time that Stoddart made him the offer, and he offered Wilde an advance of £200 for a 30,000-word story or novelette. This was scheduled to be published in 1890, and indeed it was ready for publication. The first version of the Picture of Dorian Gray was ready for publication, and it was published in the spring of 1890. This publication was followed by a rash of negative reviews, a lot of backlash, a lot of criticism, a lot of attacks on both the work's aesthetics as well as on the personal life of the author. Following this, Wilde replied to many of these reviews individually by writing public letters and replies to the editors and reviewers. But he also produced another response, which is probably the strongest, most important response Oscar Wilde published in response to the swathe of negative reviews. And this was the book version of the same novel. The text was expanded, many sections were revised, and the story which first appeared in magazine form was published in the book form by Ward, Locke & Co. These were the British distributors of the American magazine. The same publisher who distributed this American magazine agreed to publish The Picture of Dorian Gray in the form of a book. This was published in spring 1891. The editions that are in print today, most editions use this expanded, revised book version, not the version that was published in the magazine. But it is crucial to understand the evolution of the novel from its magazine publication. It's crucial because in this evolution we can understand how and why the novel took the particular shape in which we find it today. In particular, the author's views on aesthetics, the author's comments on the relationship between art and morality, which are today considered the most dominant intellectual and thematic aspects of Oscar Wilde's work. These ideas, which are articulated in the book version of The Picture of Dorian Gray, these ideas could not have existed without the negative reviews, without conversation, without the public dialogue and debate on aesthetics and morality, which were occasioned by the magazine publication. So the dialogue between the magazine publication and the book publication is crucial to understanding both the novel as well as the intellectual development of the author, that is Oscar Wilde, and that is what we will do shortly. The key idea that Oscar Wilde capitalized on at the time that he wrote the story for the magazine was a popular story which deployed a very popular theme, that of the split personality. In drawing on this theme, Wilde was drawing on the popularity of another writer, the popularity that Robert Louis Stevenson had enjoyed a few years earlier with his novella Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This was published in the year 1886 and is quite a powerful and remarkable story, as many of you will have already known from the lectures on this text in this very course. In this tale, which is quite a powerful tale, Stevenson's depiction of a mad scientist whose homicidal alter ego lurks within his soul inadvertently and inventively absorbs the structure of the modern medical case history into the much older literary tradition known as the Gothic. So Stevenson is combining two genres, that is the medical case history and the story of the Gothic. Here, by doing so, he reinvents the Gothic, which has always already drawn on stories of science and medicine, stories of science, technology, and medicine. So this was what Stevenson did, and Wilde took a leaf from Stevenson's book and turned the story inside out. Wilde split the personality of his lead character, that is Dorian Gray, in a different way. So just like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are basically two versions, two avatars of the same person in Stevenson's tale, similarly in Oscar Wilde's story, the personality of Dorian Gray is split. It is split, however, in a very different way from Stevenson's story. In The Picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde turned Stevenson's murderous double inside out. So it's not that the double exists in the person, but the double or the secret self exists outside the person. In The Picture of Dorian Gray, the eponymous protagonist's secret sins are not carried out by a secret version of him that turns out at night, but rather are represented in a physical artifact outside the body of Dorian Gray. That is, they are represented on an exquisitely painted portrait of Dorian Gray. As Dorian commits more crimes, the more unsightly the portrait becomes. Meanwhile, no matter how much destruction he wreaks or how much he is supposed to age, his ever-youthful beauty defies the ravages of time. So this is what happens in the beginning. This is how the novel begins. Dorian Gray has a portrait, and the portrait carries the sins of the real person. That is, Dorian Gray commits sins and does evil things, does bad things, but he doesn't show any effect of these actions on his physical person. Instead, the effects of these sins are visible only on the portrait, which nobody can see except a few people. This is how the novel begins. Let us now understand how this theme is developed by tracking the events, characters, and plots of the novel. The novel begins when Basil Hallward, a painter, has a conversation with a friend of his whose name is Lord Henry Wotton. Basil is an artist, is lonely, is romantic, and is single. This is a list of adjectives that describes the kind of person that Basil is. Lord Henry, on the other hand, is married, is a dandy, and is an aesthete. That is, he loves to revel in salacious and slanderous gossip. He enjoys discussing relationships, and especially scandalous relationships. He doesn't take risks that would threaten his own privilege, and he enjoys only that much of his privilege which he can without threatening his position in society. So he's a bit of a hypocrite, but that part will be described much later. These two individuals are part of Victorian society. That is, they live in the West End, and they come from the most privileged section of Victorian England. In the opening scene, Basil tells Henry that Basil has something important to share. Basil is about to finish a portrait, but he's anxious about the portrait. He's anxious because of two things, and this is the first time that the novel introduces the name Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray is the subject of the portrait. The portrait that Basil is about to finish is that of Dorian Gray. This is the first time that we hear the name Dorian Gray. Basil is anxious, however, even before the portrait is finished, for two reasons. The first is that Basil fears that he may have put too much of himself in it. That is, he fears that in the portrait that he has painted, he might inadvertently reveal more than he intends to, or more than is considered proper, or more than is considered moral, or more than is considered legal. These are not words that Basil uses, but intelligent and scholarly readers with a sense of the stakes involved in this novel can infer these concerns from Basil's first reason to be anxious, that he seems to, or he fears that he may have put too much of himself in this portrait. The second reason for Basil's anxiety is something to do with the personality of Dorian. Basil repeats a thought twice to Henry, says he likes me. That is, he suspects that Dorian likes Basil. Further, he repeats it and he says, I know he likes me. The liking of Dorian is enough to cause anxiety to Basil. We're not told why this liking can be a source of anxiety, but we will soon figure out exactly why this is the case. Meanwhile, we are privy to Lord Henry's reaction to this portrait. And Lord Henry says one very key thing upon seeing the portrait. He says, this young Adonis. The word Adonis comes from Greek mythology. Adonis is the eternally youthful god of beauty and desire. However, in the sense in which Lord Henry uses Adonis, there's also a hint of arrogance. There's also more than a hint of vanity, and there's more than a hint of the kind of power that this young man seems to have or seems to possess through his strikingly good looks. There's also more than a hint of sexuality in this word Adonis, and the combination of sexuality and power in the way Lord Henry describes the portrait as that of a young Adonis. Lord Henry implies that the person whose portrait he is seeing is aware of the power that he has over other people simply by virtue of having a face or an appearance like that. These are the implications. These are thoughts we can infer from that opening scene. Further, upon knowing Henry's reaction, upon hearing the words, this young Adonis, come from Henry's mouth, Hallward makes a plea. Basil, that is to say, Basil Hallward makes a plea. He pleads with Henry to not spoil him. Don't spoil him, is what Hallward says. Further, he says, don't try to influence him. Such words provide sufficient foreshadowing for us to infer that this is exactly what Lord Henry will do, at least from the perspective of Basil and from a very dominant perspective in the novel, a very commonsensical, a very objective, matter-of-fact perspective, a very factual reading of the novel will suggest to us that this is exactly what will happen after this. Lord Henry will spoil Dorian Gray. Lord Henry will influence Dorian Gray. And indeed, there's a lot to believe this claim because in the novel, Dorian's decline begins with Henry's words. Among the earliest statements that Henry makes go something like this. The only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Further, he says, resist it and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden to itself. This is among the earliest and most powerful things that Lord Henry tells Dorian. And Dorian admits that these words have a very powerful and magical effect on his own personality. Very soon, Lord Henry's sparkling epigrams, and the novel is really full of very witty, clever and stylish statements like the one I just quoted. These epigrams awaken forbidden thoughts in a very susceptible Dorian. Once, Lord Henry observes quite ominously that his young new companion has only a few years in which to live really perfectly and fully. Again, a subtle, implied, but not exactly spelt out relation between sexuality and youth. Dorian hears this and he fears becoming old. He fears aging, and he describes aging as a process of becoming sallow, hollow-cheeked and dull-eyed. How sad it is, the youth despairs, looking at the finished portrait. And Dorian articulates the conceit that lies at the foundation of this novel. Dorian says, I shall grow old, but this picture will remain always young. The very idea that the picture will retain its youth while his body will suffer the torment of old age arouses violence. Instead of appreciating the work of art, Dorian turns quite violent, and he attributes that violence to things outside his own body. He says, it will mock me someday, mock me horribly. That is, he projects a violence that does not exist in the painting, and he attributes a violent action to the painting. He personifies the painting and imagines that the painting will mock him for aging. We can see that something very intense, something very powerful, and a very damaging psychological process has begun. And we are not sure if it is Henry's words which have produced it or the beauty of Basil's painting. But we do know that Dorian is at the heart of this very powerful development, and violence is also a very important part of it, even at this very early stage. We soon learn that there is also a powerful difference between Lord Henry and these two other men, that is, Basil Hallward and Dorian Gray. Both Basil and Dorian have a sincerity to their behavior and their relationships. By sincere, I mean both these characters truly feel what they say. Henry, on the other hand, has the approach of a scientist. Henry regards Dorian Gray as, in his words, interesting study. The narrator also describes that Lord Henry's fascination with Dorian Gray is based on, quote, an experimental method, unquote, that aims at, quote, a scientific analysis of the passions, unquote. So this approach describes the growing scientific temperament in the late Victorian era, but it also describes the growing scientific temperament not towards the natural world, but also towards human bodies and also towards works of art. So psychology and aesthetics were two very important disciplines of study which had begun to grow in authority in the late Victorian age. And in Henry's attitude towards Dorian Gray, Henry's approach towards Dorian Gray as someone who can be a fit subject for an experiment in aesthetics, an experiment, an analysis of passions, reflects the growing popularity as well as authority of both psychology and aesthetics. Henry anticipates the rich and fruitful results that will arise from mentoring a naive individual whose impressionability is for him nothing more than a source of idle amusement. The experiment might go well or in an interesting way for Henry, but it proceeds to have disastrous consequences for Dorian. As one of the earliest effects, Dorian moves away from privilege and prestige and moves towards crime and poverty. Spatially, the move is from west to east. The West End of London, which I've just mentioned earlier, is where most of these characters live. That is, the three of them, Basil, Henry, and Dorian. The localities that they inhabit are Hyde Park and Piccadilly. As a consequence of hearing the powerful, stylish, and clever things that Henry says, Dorian begins to spend less time in these areas and more time in neighborhoods that were known to be the dens of immorality, vice, illegality, and most sensationally to the readers of newspapers and magazines in the West End, places known for illicit sexuality, or in the case of Dorian Gray and Oscar Wilde, as would become apparent in the trial for gross indecency, this illicit sexuality was more often equated with homosexuality. But before all that happens, Dorian Gray is actually quite grateful, and before he enters deep into that space of criminality, poverty, and violence, Dorian is quite happy. He enjoys his newfound pursuit of sensuality, and he thanks Lord Henry for this pursuit. He tells Henry, "You fill me with the wild desire to know everything about life." As one of his earliest movements into this new world of immorality, he enters a theater and it's a theater that's intended for a very working class and not very rich and not very sophisticated clientele. So the kind of plays they stage also deal with less than civilized or sexual and popular matters. In this theater, he meets an actress, Sybil Vane. He treats her horribly, abandons her, and abandons himself even more completely at the end of this romance to the dimly lit streets and the gaunt black-shadowed archways of East London. And he spends more and more time at night outside in East London and returns early in the morning when he happens to notice that his portrait is changing. And the picture would be to him the visible emblem of conscience. That is, everything that he knows that he's doing is wrong, but is unable to stop himself from doing. The guilt of that action is reflected on the portrait which he keeps at home. He abandons the disillusioned Sibyl, that is this woman with whom he has a brief, short-lived and painful affair, painful more for the woman than for Dorian. His portrait's eye-catching feature begin to turn grotesque. That is, this is the first instance of Dorian committing an act of violence by justifying it in the name of the pursuit of pleasure and beauty, that when he returns home, he sees that his portrait has changed. The portrait, which was an image of innocent beauty, begins to appear a little bit grotesque. The implication is that with conscience, Dorian Gray would have had a more reflective and controlled approach to a world in which there are clear distinctions, not just between right and wrong, but also, as the portrait reveals, between art and reality. So because Dorian has blurred the distinctions between right and wrong, it is but natural that he would also blur the distinction between art and reality. His pursuit of pleasure finds new, more illicit, more dangerous, and more addiction-forming objects. In addition to sexuality and beauty, he also adds opium. And this goes hand in hand along with an appreciation, enjoyment, and experience of high culture or high art. There's a sense in which the novel strives to find an equality between the pursuit of addictive pleasures like opium, sexuality, etc., and in the high culture or high art that is staged in the very elite and privileged spaces of West London. Some of these works of art include Robert Schumann's forest scenes, Richard Wagner's Lohengrin, and the music played by the eminent pianist Rubinstein. All of this features in the novel, and the claim is that there is something that unites both of these high and low forms of art, and the pursuit of aesthetic pleasure or beauty in these radically different ways has something in common. But how far that commonality needs to be pursued, and to what extent the moralities, the legalities, as well as the laws of the land can be subverted in pursuit of that common unifying aesthetic ideal is a question that the novel answers through the actions of Dorian, and the final answer is a very tragic and painful one. In keeping with the theme of aesthetic pleasure and the pursuit of aesthetic pleasure, the novel describes how the fundamental change happens in Dorian's character at the receipt of a gift. Dorian is gifted a book from Lord Henry, and this book has the strangest and most powerful effect. The book is a French novel by Andrew Hoymans titled Our Repos, or Against Nature. We will discuss the effects of reading this book upon Dorian Gray, and also further understand how the blurring of boundaries between art and reality complicate things much further, and while they lead to a very tragic end for Dorian, they place us, that is readers and analysts of the novel, in a most interesting interpretive place, because the novel invites a wide range of interpretations but does not satisfy any or even the most allegorical of these interpretations. We will discuss these things and more in the next lecture. Thank you.